Welcome. These whiteboarding sessions is about AWS services and how you will use this either for your exams that you may be prepping for or in your day-to-day. These technologies speaks to a bit of whiteboarding, bit of storytelling, just to break down these concepts into easy, understandable concepts. So let's get started where for the first one, we'll talk about identity and access management. We'll go through things like authentication, authorization. How do I get a user and connect that user up to an AWS service, making sure that they can operate with those services. So let's go through these concepts for IAM, identity and access management together, shall we? Let's get started with typically a very simple terminologies as to, we've got some AWS services. So let's draw some AWS services. So there is my AWS environment. We will mark these off as well. And in that AWS environment, you could probably have an EC2 instance. You could also be using some other services as well. So you could be maybe setting up with a database. And let's draw a database out. You could be looking at even an S3 bucket. And working with that S3 bucket, you could be wanting to put items into those buckets. So let's look at these concepts, follow through one by one, and let's go by starting to label our services that we have. There's AWS. We've got an EC2 that somebody needs to connect to. We have a database that multiple people needs to connect to. And maybe we even have an S3 bucket that we would want to use as part of our integration. So there's our AWS services. How do I connect up to it? What we are talking about today is IAM, Identity and Access Management. Let me draw that out here at the end and call that IAM. Now, in Identity and Access Management, there are a few things that you would want to do. One of them would be to go and let's do this where we draw a little line between these various services that we will talk. And then what we will do is we will move Identity and Access Management right on top of that. Now, why I'm moving it over there is because we'll be talking about two concepts. The first concept that we can talk about is authentication. And what authentication is the ability to log onto AWS services. That is it. AWS works on the principle of least privilege. So although you've got a username, you've got a password, you logged in successfully, still doesn't mean that you are able to access that EC2 instance. One of the other services that you will need is authorization. So I need both authentication and I need authorization before I can get to an AWS service. How do I do this? Let's start with a single entity or principal, and that principal we will make a user. So a user is an AWS term or principal that you can use to log into AWS's environment. So for our user, we will go and we'll say we want a user and we will create a user called Bob. And there's Bob. Bob is our user that we want to create. And what we do with Bob is we say, Bob, you are an AWS user. Awesome. Now, I can give Bob his username and his password. So I can go and say, Bob, here is your username. Here's your password. Would you please log in? We could even add in something like multi-factor authentication as another means to authenticate that this user is definitely Bob. So there's Bob logged in with his username, his password, and his multi-factor authentication. And we are happy with Bob being able to log in. Awesome. But that isn't enough. What we need is to give Bob permissions. We give permissions via a policy document. So we go and we create a policy document. And that policy document will have permissions. And this is what we assign for Bob as permissions. So we can go and assign a permission set to Bob. And we could, for instance, go and say, Bob, we are giving you this kind of permissions. So let me go, just draw permissions out as a block. And in that permission set, what we have is we've got users, and our user is Bob. And that user, we are going to give some type of access into our AWS environment. So terms that we need to remember is that a user would want some effect. That effect could be allow. or that effect could be deny. We also need the A for the actions that we want to be able to perform. And if this is EC2, this typically will be EC2. And we'll say something like start an instance. And then there's also the R, and the R is for the actual resource that we would want. And we add the Amazon resource name, and I'm shortkeying all of this just for an understanding. The ARN of the specific service, and that would be AWS, could be EC2. And we could give Bob access to EC2. So now what we do is we take this policy, and with that policy, we go and we say, Bob, we are assigning that policy to you. That permission set we are assigning to Bob. What happens now is via this policy document with all of its permissions in there, Bob gets access to EC2. Awesome. But Bob is not the only entity. We could go and we could maybe have multiple users in our accounts like we have in practice. So we could have multiple users, and we could have a user called Mary. We could have a user called John. We could have a user called Jake. And we would want to give all of them access to our AWS services. Now, what we could do is we could go and say, you know what? Let's go and assign onto all of these users. We will now go and assign some kind of permissions. And we could say, let's take that same permissions and assign it to them. But that means we'll have to do this 3 times. Assign it to Mary, assign it to John, assign it to Jake. It's maybe not the best practice. Best practice in AWS is to go and to say, how about we go and we create a group? So we create a group and we take all of those users and we say, all of you are now part of this group that we want to set up. So we will now go and create a group for you all. So we create that group, and we assign a set of permissions onto that group. So no problem at all. We're all still on the same page. So let's go and copy this policy diagram over. And what we'll do now is we'll go and we'll say, we will give you access. And the same principle applies to all of our policies. That is identity-based. And identity is Bob, it's Mary, it's John, it's Jake. We add the E, and we can say we are allowing you. The action is to this database. Let's say it's our DS database. And let's say it is to stop this database. And the actual resource is the Amazon resource name of this resource, which could be our relational database. And again, I'm just shortkeying all of this. We go the same route, where what we will do now is we will go and we'll say we are assigning this policy not to each of these individual users, but we're assigning the policy on the group. All of the users in that group inherits that policy. And now John can, via this policy that he has now inherited by being added into this group, John is able to go and stop that relational database. Now, those are best practices that if you have a huge amount of users that needs the same type of access, that you create a group for them. Group doesn't have any other purpose at all except that. Now, let's talk about the third way we can do this. And this, for me, is really one of the most powerful tools within IAM, and that is roles. So we could go and create a role. And what you need to realize about the role is that the role is an entity where we can go and have a type of vehicle that multiple people can use. Think of it as a vehicle that you rent, and when you rent a vehicle for a period of time, at the end of that period, you give that vehicle back and you go on your merry way. Think of roles very similar to that, where we have this vehicle and we say, what we'll do now is we will go and add a policy for this vehicle. And let's say the same kind of policy exists where we could say, you know what, let's go at the E. We want to allow the A, let's say this action or the verb is that this S3 we want to be able to go and put an object into that S3. And then the R is the actual resource, and this is the ARN of that specific S3 bucket that we want. Now, what we've done is we've allowed access. And what we've allowed access to is via this policy. What we do with the policy is we assign it now to the role. Now note that there is nobody in that role. Remember I said, think of a role as being a vehicle that can be used. What we can now do is we could say, Bob, today I want you to have access to S3. So we let Bob, and the word that we use is assume. We let Bob assume this role. And then via this role, Bob has a policy that's been attached to that role, and that policy allows Bob access to that S3 bucket. When we have Bob assuming this role, one of the things that happens is that Bob doesn't have any kind of access to his EC2. All of that is gone. Roles are temporary, so it is seen as a temporary function. When that time expires between 1 and 12 hours, there is no more access for Bob, and Bob goes and he resumes the access that he has as to EC2, the policy that has been attached to his user called Bob. The other great thing about roles is that if we're looking at on-premises environment, so we've got multiple users in an on-premises environment. So what we can have is, this is maybe your on-premises department. Let's label that out too, and we'll call this on-prem. When you have on-prem, what we create between you and the on-premises environment is a trust relationship. So we set up a trust relationship between your on-premises environment and AWS. Now, one of the ways that we can do this is via SAML. So we could set up via SAML, we could set up a relationship. And SAML is if you may be using something like Active Directory. By Active Directory, you can create a trust relationship between your on-premises Active Directory server and AWS. So now we've got your Active Directory server. Call that your AD server. The service that you use is Active Directory Federation service. And via that Active Directory Federation service, using SAML, you'll set up that trust relationship between you and AWS. Now, whoever logs in to your on-premises environment, if you've given them the type of access to use a role, so let's say I am me at company. That is my username that I use to log into my company. And today I have logged in successfully. If I've logged in successfully and I have been given access to assume a role in AWS, I can now go and say, yes, I am also able via that role that has allowed put object of that S3 bucket, I'm now also able to have access to put an object in that S3 bucket. These are the terms that becomes quite important where we speak about users, we speak about groups, we speak about roles and authentication, authorization, all of this happening in IAM, where we will give people access either via the user. Multiple users we're able to put into a group. And if we have maybe 200 users from an on-premises environment, providing we give them access and they log in successfully into their on-premises environment, we are able to go and say, we will give access to a role, and that role will have certain permissions on it, and that role allows you to have access to AWS in whatever capacity they have with the necessary roles that you've set up for them. Typically, I've mentioned that with the policy, we look at the E, the A, and the R. Policies generally looks very, very cool and very easy to use. For instance, I'll draw out what a policy document will look at. Maybe I'll just write it out over there. And first thing that we normally do is we put in our version. And that version will be, let's say, 2012, 10, 17. And we will then say, next is what is a statement that we want to put into play. And we'll have that statement in there too. And we note, I'll now have my curly bracket. And now we'll start with the E, which would be the effect. And we could be saying allow. There's my allow. We could then say the actions that I want to allow, and that will be actions. And this could be allow access to S3 list object. And then come over there as well, come over there. And then I could be saying something like the resource that I need as well. So you'll see the E, the A, and the R that I have over there. The resource that I want, and again in brackets, and that actual resource will be the ARN, Amazon resource name. It will be AWS. For instance, if this is S3, it will be S3, and then it will be some other details that we'll need in there as well. Like we don't need to put in some details, so we can just say dot, 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 and then example. And the bucket, if that bucket name is called example, and then we will close that up. So typically that will be your statement. We'll then need to close that statement up, and then we will need to close it all up. So that is typically what a statement will look like. Now, there's another place that we can also add a policy on, and this would be a resource-based policy. What we spoke about with Bob, Mary, John, Jake, and the roles are identity-based policy. We could add a different type of policy. For instance, we could say, you know what, Martha, or on this S3 resource, we will go and say there is an S3 resource. And again, what we spoke about now is we could add the E, the A, and the R. And then what we will add on top of that is a P for the principal. So we add the principal, and this principal could be Bob, it could be Mary, it could be John, it could be Jake. That would be the principal. The others still apply where we have the effect, allow or deny. We'll have the action, the actual verb that we want to accomplish, and then the resource. This would be that specific S3 bucket that we want that resource on, and that we will call a resource-based policy. So we have different types of policies, and depending on how tight we want this environment to be as far as policies are concerned, we could add these various kinds of policies. So that's a resource-based policy. While what we have with the others as my resource-based policy, what we have with the others over here, these we call identity-based policy. These concepts becomes fairly important in your day-to-day when you work with AWS, and they definitely are things that you will encounter in your associate exam, in your CPE exam. You'll definitely have some of these concepts coming up. Hopefully that has been a good explanation for you using whiteboarding, making sure that you understand the concepts. And if you liked it, hey, please let me know. More than welcome to amend, to adapt, and to also give you what you want as far as other services or concepts that you need to explain as well using some whiteboarding. It's been an absolute pleasure. And don't forget to follow. Cheers, everybody.